Good evening, everybody. We'll start with some introductions. Julian, do you want to go first?
Yeah, I definitely drew the short straw here by going first. So yes, my name's Julian. I'm Julian Gwinnett, actually. In fact, the name says on the screen, and I'm one of the 3 co-chairs in the University Disabled Staff Network. You've just seen the other one of the others, which is Mel, and I am actually autistic. So I've outed myself there.
Thanks, Julian. So I'll go next as I'm in the middle. My name's Stuart. I'm a senior lecturer in the SEND department at the university. So I teach on the SENCO course, training school staff. And I've recently worked with my colleague Peter, who will introduce himself in the second, to develop some resources for SENCOs to use, including that we've just written a chapter of a book that's due to be released very shortly. Peter?
Yeah, hello everyone. I'm Peter Harwood, similarly senior lecturer teaching scholarship and professional practice, as it says there, which essentially means special educational needs. And I was in the past head of SENAR for Birmingham briefly, and in Worcestershire. That's over 10 years ago, but I've got that experience of being responsible for statutory assessment. Also have 4 children, 3 of whom have special educational needs, 2 have education, health and care plans, so bring that perspective as well. Thanks, Zoe.
No worries. So Julian's going to start us off. Julian, do you want to start off with telling us just a little bit about autism and a bit of background?
Well, we have a lot about autism, but before I start, I should say that one of the things with autism is that, as you just saw there, that asking, like remembering to say who you are when people ask you, can actually be really quite challenging, as I've got to say quite a lot about myself. But anyway, I'll carry on. So to begin with, what is autism? Autism is a spectrum condition and affects people in different ways. Like all people, autistic people have their own unique strengths and weaknesses. When you meet one autistic person, you've met one autistic person. Indeed, the definition of autism has changed over time and is often disagreed upon. It was previously considered a psychiatric condition, whereas today it is classed as a developmental disorder. I always find that word really difficult to pronounce. Now, our definition of autism may well change again as our understanding of it changes to more accurately reflect the lived experience of autistic people. The definition here that you can see on screen is taken from the National Autistic Society. Whilst many would agree this definition is too broad, the diagram to the right of it makes a very important point. Autism is not linear, and there isn't always a clear distinction between autistic individuals in terms of what we can or can't do, as despite having various support needs, autistic people and their families often share many of the same challenges. This could be getting enough support for mental health, education and social care services, all being misunderstood by people close to them, such as friends. It's also important to be aware that functioning labels, such as high and low functioning, can often be very misleading. For instance, high functioning tends to conjure an image of a child who is academically able and performing well at school. However, that doesn't mean that there aren't times when they struggle. A label such as high functioning could diminish their struggles. Conversely, labeling someone as low functioning may limit their potential. There are times and situations for all of us where we can function at high or low level, but when the situation changes, so does our ability to function. Moreover, for some autistic people, there is no correlation between their ability to do simple or more complex tasks, meaning something relatively simple, such as reading and responding to emails, can be very challenging, whereas understanding complex AI systems can be very easy by comparison. So often, a label isn't always helpful. Can you go to the next slide, Zoe? Oh, what happened?
Is it still there?
Am I still there?
You're still there, but is that point where you expected?
Oh, right. I just got a little bit phased because I couldn't see the screen.
No worries.
So I understand Understandably, many parents worry when they have their first conversation with someone at school, perhaps with a special education needs coordinator, and autism is mentioned. There are so many stereotypical representations of autism in film, TV, and media, all of which can create a confused, inaccurate, and unhelpful image of what life is like for autistic people and their families. So perhaps it's no wonder that parents may panic and worry about what a diagnosis could mean for their child, particularly if they have little or no first-hand experience of what autism is. So what does being autistic mean? This list that you can see on screen is designed to give you an idea of some of the ways that autism can present. However, it's important to know that this isn't an exhaustive list and it isn't a tick list either. So starting from the beginning with the first item on the list, social communication. Although autistic people can often be sociable and chatty, like myself hopefully, we can still have issues with social communication. This includes interacting with others, initiating conversations, and understanding and relating to other people. This means we often fail to understand the subtext or the nuances of communication. We can struggle to understand what someone is saying, to know what to say in response, or how to say it even. We can also be oblivious to non-verbal forms of communication and have difficulty reading and understanding body language. Moreover, we often don't know how to begin a conversation or how to introduce ourselves to someone new. We find small talk especially challenging. It's like a completely different language, one we simply don't understand. Furthermore, we don't get open-ended questions such as "how are you?" and struggle to find an answer. We also tend to take things very literally. So if someone were to ask us that question, we'll spend half an hour telling them exactly how we're feeling without realizing that's probably not what they meant. For autistic people, nearly every conversation is in fact two conversations that happen simultaneously. There's the conversation itself with another person or persons, and then there's the internal conversation that happens inside your head, like an inner monologue that's constantly reminding you about what to do when you're having a conversation, telling you to make and maintain eye contact, not to speak over or interrupt someone, to show them you're engaged and listening to what they're saying. All these things are unnatural to us. We must learn how to do them. So imagine what it's like to have to do that every time you speak to someone. Second item on this, social and restrictive behaviour. One of the ways that autistic people deal with the demands they face is by engaging in repetitive and restrictive behaviours, often referred to as stimming, which is short for self-stimulation. For autistic people, stimming is a way of helping them to adopt their environment. For others, it's a way to counteract or overcome an overwhelming sensory input or to reduce anxiety. However, it's sometimes something that we do when we feel the need for more sensory and stimulation. We may not even be aware that we're doing it. Stimming can take many forms, including rocking backwards and forwards in our chair, flapping hands, twirling our hair, or squeezing a stress ball. Sometimes it's obvious, sometimes less so. And actually, I'm stimming right now, squeezing this ball of therapy putty, and it's really helping me to focus whilst I'm presenting. So stimming can be perfectly natural, and it can be a real help and benefit to autistic people, enabling us to concentrate and focus. As for sensory processing, autistic people process sensory information very differently to non-autistic people. We can be both under or overstimulated when it comes to sensory input. If we're understimulated, we can fail to be aware of what's happening around us, as sights and sounds don't register with us. Conversely, if we're overstimulated, we can have a very strong reaction to loud noises, bright lights, strong smells, or being touched, even without warning, especially without warning, as we can be a lot more sensitive to things that most people barely register. So a background noise that most people just don't hear can be really painful to us. Likewise, bright lights in a supermarket can be extremely disorientating, and the smell of a freshly painted room can be really overpowering. We often have an issue with certain types of food due to the texture, the taste, or how it feels inside our mouths. So depending on whether we're under or overstimulated, we either perceive them as being too bland or too spicy. Accordingly, we can be very unadventurous with food. So many of us prefer to eat something that we know and that we're familiar with, even if this means eating the same meals every day with no variation. Now, for focused interests, to non-autistic people, and I imagine that's most people, special interests may seem unusual, strange, even antisocial, and perhaps something that should be discouraged. Yet for autistic people such as myself, they can be a tremendous source of joy and excitement, and more than anything else, the thing that makes us who we are. For those who aren't aware, focused interests, often called special interests by autistic people, involve a highly focused level of interest in a particular topic. This interest can be anything and may not always stand out as being unusual in quite the same way as boys who have a passionate interest about trains or dinosaurs do. If you're looking out for stereotypical autistic focused interests, there's a good chance you may miss out on ones that are hiding in plain sight. The important thing to note about focused interests is that it isn't the interest itself that qualifies as a focused special interest. It's the degree to which someone is consumed by that interest. As often, when an autistic person has a special interest, it can be all we think about. We live, sleep, and breathe special interests. So taking as an example here, take football for an example. It's not unusual for boys to be interested in football. However, if a particular boy follows a particular team, knows everything about that team, every player who's ever played for them, the results of every game in a season, and who scored in each game, there's a very good chance that that qualifies as a special interest. As for masking, many autistic people learn to behave in neurotypical ways and disguise their autistic traits. This is known as masking. When an autistic person masks, they copy the gestures or facial expressions of people they're around or in conversation with, and they deliberately force themselves to make eye contact during conversations with them. Accordingly, an autistic person who masks is suppressing their autistic traits in order to fit in with people around them. This means they're pretending to be someone else, someone who isn't autistic, in order to form social ties and avoid rejection. The important thing to say about masking from an autistic perspective is that it's exhausting, as it can seriously drain you of all the energy you have, leaving you with nothing for anything else. Masking can be a cause of anxiety. Now, everyone experiences anxiety, but for autistic people, anxiety is a constant presence in our lives. Any situation that we haven't planned for, we don't know what to expect, can be a cause of anxiety, and often is. Starting school can be a cause of anxiety, but so can changing class or teacher. Even going on holiday can be a cause of anxiety, as there are so many ways in which things can go wrong. And now, along with anxiety, are meltdowns, because meltdowns are something else an autistic person can experience a lot of. There can even be a link between them. A meltdown is what happens when an autistic person is completely overwhelmed by their current situation and unable to control how it affects their behaviour. A child with autism may act and behave as if they're having a tantrum when they're experiencing a meltdown, but they're not. Because a tantrum is something that happens when a child wants something, and it usually ends when either they get what they want or they realise it's pointless in carrying on. Whereas a child who's experiencing a meltdown cannot stop it, and they're not able to control what's causing it. In a situation like this, it's best to find a quiet, stress-free space and wait for the meltdown to pass. It's also helpful to identify any possible triggers or things that may have caused them. Now, shutdowns are also, in many ways, similar to meltdowns. They can also occur when someone is feeling completely overwhelmed by their current situation, or their anxiety levels are so high that they cannot contain them. However, shutdowns are more subtle than meltdowns, and they can also last a lot longer. When you're having a shutdown, it's like your entire body stops working. You can be unresponsive, withdrawn, and you just want to lie somewhere and wait for everything to go away. The best way to deal with this is to try to stay calm, to find something comforting and reassuring to do. Something to stim with can also be an enormous help in this situation, as it's often a way to counteract or overcome an overwhelming sensory input, or to reduce anxiety. Can we go to the next slide, please? Is the next slide up?
It is.
Brilliant. Okay, now, at present, more men and boys are diagnosed as autistic than women and girls. Current estimates are that the ratio of boys is now 3:1. No one knows for certain why this is the case. A variety of different reasons have been explored. However, there's still no definitive answer. However, as we learn more about autism and discover how it presents differently in males and females, the ratio of boys to girls continues to fall. Therefore, it may be our lack of understanding of how autism presents differently in females, which is the reason why so many girls and women go undiagnosed. So how does autism present differently in males and females? Well, firstly, girls may experience fewer social difficulties than boys. They can often have less trouble making friends at school and have more interest in doing so. Whereas boys tend to be less interested in making and maintaining friendships, and they can often appear to be happier in their own company or pursuing their own interests. Now, girls are more likely than boys to mask, and masking, as I said earlier, is a tool that autistic people use to fit in and form relationships with other people. People who might otherwise reject them if they actually understood or were aware of how different they were. And for that reason, girls may be more likely to experience anxiety than boys, as masking not only takes a lot of energy, it can be a serious cause of both stress and anxiety. Because if you think about it, if you spent a whole day disguising your autistic traits, pretending to be somebody else to fit in with your peers, this is going to have a serious impact on your well-being. Boys have more repetitive behaviours than girls that can more closely fit stereotypical autistic behaviour, such as rocking backwards and forwards in a chair or staring intently into space, something I do quite a lot. Whereas girls tend to be much more subtle, twirling their hair with their fingers. This is something that can often be mistaken for shyness. Now, boys usually have more unusual focused interests than girls. Obvious ones include dinosaurs and trains, as I mentioned earlier. Other common interests can include rockets and space travel, whereas girls tend to choose interests that are more, by comparison, are considered to be more acceptable and less obviously autistic. However, as I said earlier, it's the level of interest that's important and not the interest alone that determines whether a special interest is a special interest. Now, to summarise, before I hand over, every autistic person is different and their experience of autism is unique to them. So doubtless, as we learn more about autism through the experience of autistic people, we will begin to challenge, hopefully, many of the preconceptions we have and have a more and develop a more balanced and informed understanding of what autism really is. Finally, and I can't say this often enough, autistic people can lead successful and independent lives. Indeed, many of us do. We just need a little help and support to enable us to be the best versions of ourselves. That's me finished.
Thanks, Julian. Okay, so I'm going to pick up from here. And what I'd like to talk about a little bit is what should you do if you think that your child might be autistic. Similar to Peter, I've got 3 children. I've got two of which have got special educational needs. I've got one in mainstream schooling, one in special ed. And I think this stage for me was the bit that was probably the most daunting and overwhelming. It's when I realised that I needed some help and support, I didn't really know where to go or what that conversation should look like. And I think many parents will identify with that. In terms of who you can speak to, if you've got a fab relationship with your GP can be a huge source of information and support. And for children under 5, your health visitor is quite often a really good person to talk to. It may well be that there are other health professionals that are involved in your child's care. And again, sometimes the conversation can start with somebody in the medical field. It may be, if your child's of school age, that you can reach out to your child's class teacher, or to reach out to the special educational needs coordinator in school. And all schools have got one, and you're perfectly fine to ask for a chat. It may be that you don't want to reach out that sort of formal way to start with. And there are some absolutely amazing parental support groups that might be your first port of call, talking to other mums and dads, and just having a bit of a natter to open that conversation. But when you realise that you'd like to have that conversation and you've picked who you'd like to have it with, it's starting to think about, well, what will that conversation look like? What will I say? And it's about, well, what are my worries? What support do I think might be helpful at this stage? And I think this was the point for me that I started to worry about a diagnosis, which felt kind of really formal. And I think many parents will worry about diagnosis and a label. But at this very early stage, I don't think that's something that you need to worry about. I think it's about reaching out for some support for your child, but for you as well, to help with your understanding, and to not worry about the kind of the diagnostic process at that stage. In terms of what a diagnosis would mean, it would mean more specialist support. And many parents decide that they would like to pursue a diagnosis to enable that specialist support, but you don't have to. You can still get support for your child without a diagnosis. In terms of for my own son, he felt that the diagnosis was a really pivotal moment for him, and actually gave meaning to a lot of the things that he'd felt made him different. And so from my point of view, I can only say that the diagnosis process for my family was immensely positive, but it's not the right decision for every family, and that's something that by building this support network, you can start to open those conversations. So I think you need to find trusted people that you can start to have those conversations with. This is just as much about developing a support network for you as a parent as it is about getting specialist support for your child. So I'm going to pass over to Peter now, if that's okay. Peter, are you there?
Yeah, I'm here. Okay. Yeah, thanks, Zoe. I've just put this slide up. It's something that I'm sure many of you will have seen. If you want more detail on the statutory assessment process, the best bet is really to go to the National Autistic Society website or the independent provider of special education advice, IPSIA site, and they've got lots and lots of resources. So I don't propose to talk through each of these points. I just wanted to identify a couple of myths really around the statutory process and just highlight a couple of points. The first one, I suppose, is that this is the stage of assessment where you are seeking to have your child in a position where an education, health and care plan might be written for them, okay? So when I talk about assessment, I'm talking about it in relation to an EHCP for the next slide or two. So you might hear from your child's school that an education, health and care plan or an educational health and care needs assessment is required or requested, or you may want to request one yourself. And I know many people will know that they have the right to do that, but a lot of people don't. I think there are, that's one of the first myths, I think, that only the school can make the request for an EHCP. There is a debate about how successful those requests that come from parents are compared to those that come from school, but that's a slightly different issue. But you certainly have the right to make a request for an assessment. And once that request is made, the local authority must, by law, comply with it. In other words, they must do something. Okay. And there are only 3 areas where they can say, or 3 reasons they can give for not carrying out an assessment. The first is that you've already got an EHCP. The second is that you've had an assessment within 6 months. And the third is, and this is probably the trickiest, that the local authority, when looking at the evidence, believes that an EHC needs assessment is not necessary. Now, that's obviously a point of debate and a point of contention and subjectivity. But certainly what parents, guardians, and indeed schools need to do at any point where an EHCP plan is likely is to begin to gather evidence. Okay. And that evidence should take the form of letters, it should take the form of reports, anything which is pertinent to the area of need. And I'm talking generally here, not just about autism, but I will make some specific points in a moment. The school's position is to demonstrate that through these reports that all reasonable steps, and I'm putting that in air quotes, to help your child have been taken. And again, that's an area where there could be debate, because one person's reasonable is another person's unreasonable. So, that's something in the law that's not as clear as it might be. The significant point is that having made those steps, the child has still not made the expected process. And I think this is where I want to make another comment about the role of the parent and the experience of the parent, to build a little bit on what Zoe's just said. I know from my own experience, when my children were going through education, health and care plans, it felt counterintuitive, because you spend your whole life talking them up and being positive about what they can do. But actually, when you're doing the plan, or sorry, the gathering the evidence towards the plan, what you need to do is emphasize the deficit. You need to emphasize the areas of need, and that can be quite difficult for parents. And it's something that we have to really get to grips with. Otherwise, we will undersell, if you like, the level of support required. And then just a couple of myths. The first one really is quite widely used by various people to explain delays, and that is that the process of assessment for an EHCP will come off the back of the kind of ordinary SEN support that a child may already have received, and the assess plan do review cycle that all schools and settings use to put provision in place for children on that graduated curve of need. Now people believe that there are a certain number of cycles of review that you have to have gone through before you can apply to for an EHCP. That's not true. All right, that's not in the code. Okay, LAs may have guidance, they may have views, they may have custom and practice, but that's not actually in the code. So if your child's needs are clearly in need of significant support at that point, then you can make a request, or the school should be making a request. The other myth related to that is this notion that your child has to be behind others in order to make a request for a school to request an education, health and care plan. That again is not the case. Indeed, many children who are autistic may well be very able academically. They may be achieving very well in comparison to others. And it could be, and I'm not saying it would always be, but it could be their social and communication difficulties, which mean they're not reaching their individual potential. So many of the support sites will emphasize this, that parents shouldn't be put off by statements along the lines of, there are worse children than this in this school, or, they haven't reached this threshold. If the need is there, then the assessment ought to be made. And ultimately, the diagnosis is immaterial. It's need that matters. Okay, now, when I say that, I don't mean to insult anyone. The diagnosis, of course, in the context of what Zoe was saying, can be hugely important to an individual. But as far as the process of an EHCP is concerned, it's the need that's important. Okay, so if I go on to the next slide, Zoe, I've called this one reality check, and I just want to justify my use of that term, again, in case anyone is slightly offended. There's no intention here of me implying that people are unrealistic in their expectations of the process. I think the reason for using those terms, or that term, is that it's the kind of language that's prevalent around discourses of education, health and care planning. That people need to be realistic about their expectations. And I think we need to kind of push back against that. And we need to be saying I'm sorry about the constant use of the word need, but need is what matters, okay? Having said that, we do have to be realistic, and there are just some points to be aware of. And I've tried to keep it relatively brief, but, the number of plans issued every year is increasing year on year on year from 2015. Which inevitably is putting pressure on bits of the system. And the proportion of new plans issued within 20 weeks, which is the statutory requirement, is reducing year on year. So the 2022 figures, actually that disguises exemptions, which is a technicality, but it's around 50%, it's slightly under 50% actually, of plans that were issued within 20 weeks, okay? Now that doesn't necessarily mean that local authorities are acting illegally or that the process is failing. There are some legitimate exemptions where any member of the community that's working towards the plan can say, for this reason, we're going to have to suspend the 20-week timetable. Now, it's not good enough to say summer holidays, but it could be that people are not available during summer holidays for a particular assessment. It could be that an assessment takes longer than anticipated. There could be quite a few different events which can legitimately be claimed as exemptions or exceptions. Okay. The key point is that while you wait for an assessment, and Zoe's already touched on much of this, so I'm just going to flag it really, there are things you can be doing. Now, I know each of these has its own set of challenges. Getting a GP's appointment is not the easiest thing in the world, but, there are things you can be doing. You can be seeking support. We've put some links in here. Local support groups, I would argue, are really, really important and central, and the place to start. You can look for needs assessments, health needs assessments. There's a guidance document there that you might want to reference. The key, I would say, is don't wait for the process. Begin your activity of gathering evidence, gathering data, gathering your kind of position papers, if you like, because you're going to need that in order to make the case. And it feels counterintuitive, as I say, but I think nonetheless it's really, really important. Now, I don't think I've got time to go into too much detail about the future, but I was going to just say one or two things before I get into the next slide, which is that in March of this year, 2023, the government published its SEND and Alternative Provision Improvement Plan, which followed a green paper on SEND reform. Now, putting it briefly and as kind of neutrally as I can, it was presented as sort of transformational change. It may well turn out to be transformational change, but actually nothing much is planned to change or to improve the system now or even this year. Most of what's in the improvement plan won't be introduced before 2025. by which time there will be a general election potentially. So the electoral cycles and all of that might suggest, and I'm not saying this is the case, but it might suggest that these plans for change are not as pressing as they might seem. And if we go on to the next slide, Zoe, that connects with my next point really, which is that therefore, we need to look for certainties, don't we? Because the system will flex and change. I've worked in this area for a long time, and there's been, 2 codes of practice. There's been different approaches. The language might shift, but there will be some central points. And I like this quote. It's taken from a blog that I'm not sort of endorsing. I just found randomly, but I do like this quote because it kind of summarizes a key point for me, which is that we can sometimes be fooled into thinking everybody else has the answer and is the expert. And actually, those of us who have children with autism or other special educational needs, and indeed those of us with children, are experts in our children. We know them better than anyone. And I think it's really, really important that you put yourself in a position where you are able to be that expert. And one of the things that is required for that to happen is a good relationship with the school and a good relationship particularly with the key stakeholder, who I think is likely to remain the key stakeholder, and that is the SENCO. Okay, now as Zoe said, we teach on the SENCO award. That's changing. There's going to be differences around the way in which the SENCO role might be kind of deployed, but I can't see a system in the near future that won't have a role like that in it. Okay, and that's not to say that you need to kind of buddy up to them or to make them your best friend, but I think it's important that you understand where they're coming from, that you have a sense of their role, a sense of where they are in the organization. And one of the things I'm very conscious, I don't want to talk negatively tonight. I think none of us do, because as Julian's brilliantly illustrated, there's huge kind of positives to this world, and I'm going to talk a bit more about that in a minute. But one of the kind of defining features of a parent's experience of special educational needs and the special educational needs system is that parents report a sense of being in a battle and a fight. All right, and that's not just my perception. The evidence from literature suggests that that's the case, that families with children with disabilities have much more, just in terms of volume, much more, sorry on my language, they have many more encounters with the school, right? Many more formal encounters with the school, and those kind of encounters can at times lead to anxiety, can lead to hostility on both sides, and that can result in the parents feeling that they're in this constant battle. Now, I'm not sitting here to say that you're wrong in thinking that. What I would say is if you're able to get to a position where you are an active co-producer of your child's plan, then that's got to be a much better place to be. And it's not easy, and I'm not suggesting it is. It requires you to be informed. It requires you to be engaged. It requires you, frankly, to put quite a lot of work in, which is really difficult. And I know you know this, so I don't mean to patronize people. But I think that co-production is the kind of the area that we're more likely to get a better outcome for children and young people. Zoe, the next one I think is my last one, and I'll be as quick as I can looking at the time. I just wanted to acknowledge really the extent to which sections of the autism community are increasingly focused on this area, which is to define neurodiversity really, and the ways in which autism can be understood and discussed separately from a discussion of disability. I think I would acknowledge most of my work and interest is focused on disability and inclusion and autism within that context. But it's really important to say that the two things are not the same. The reality is that although the majority of children and young people with autism may have a learning disability, there is a significant minority, which is variously described in literature anywhere between 30 and 40%. Right, it varies quite a lot from study to study, but it's a significant minority who do not have a learning disability. So the last thing I really wanted to say is that there's this long history of autism intervention, which you know, not to put it too simplistically, is about seeking a cure, I suppose, and seeking a way of fixing the problem, and perhaps sitting in a more medical model of disability. And that's set against this neurodiverse approach, the neurodiversity movement, which is contradictory. And I think the neurodiverse position, or proponents of it, would argue that autism and other forms of neurocognitive difference, like ADHD, like dyslexia, are just dimensions of a rich, diverse human experience. They're just different, right? And they're characterized by a different means of experiencing, processing, understanding, and interacting with the world. Those aren't my words. That's from a writer called Chapman in 2019. But amongst that group, there seems to be a general consensus that the kind of attributes, the unique attributes, and I think it's important to put it in that positive way, associated with autism and other neurocognitive areas, should not be distilled down to a set of symptoms, vulnerabilities, disabilities that are in need of correction. Okay, so instead, the neurodiversity perspective identifies this need to promote societal education, acceptance, accommodation of the I knew I would struggle eventually to say this word, but accommodation of difference, let's put it that way. In other words, a much more social model of autism. Okay, and I'll finish there, Zoe, and hand back to you. Thank you.
Thank you. I wanted to finish off by building a little bit on what Peter said about parents as part of the team. This is, in some cases, a really seamless process where parents are seen as the experts in their own children and are warmly invited into the conversation about their children. But that isn't always the case. And as Peter said, I don't want to speak too negatively tonight, but there are things that you can do to make sure that you are part of the team and are part of that conversation. For me, my first experience with school was, as Peter referenced, this assess, plan, do, review cycle, which is also sometimes called the graduated approach. For one of my children, I was sort of warmly invited into the conversation and able to share loads of wonderful things that I discovered at home that could support my child, and school talked to me about amazing things that they've been working on too, and it felt a really collaborative approach. However, with my youngest child, that's not been the case at all, and actually I haven't felt an equal partner. So it's about, well, how do we make sure that as a parent that we're seen as part of this team, and that's sometimes quite a complex thing. What I would say is keep amazing records, because you're the central person that sees all of the aspects of sort of the GP, any medical appointments. School won't necessarily know about those. So you become that really central person that can share information and that holds most of that information, which is key. What I would suggest to you is get a really nice lever arch folder. Keep all your letters. I keep paper records. I keep electronic records. I keep emails. I keep read receipts. Particularly, and I think Peter would agree with me here, because Peter and I have both worked for local authority SEND departments. When you work for the local authority, you often don't see families. You don't see them in person. Quite often, most of the contact, I'd probably say 95% of the contact that I had with families was over the phone or by email, and I can't put a face to a name. And so SEND departments are really busy, really stretched, and quite often you as the parent are going, but I spoke to somebody last week, and the person on the end of the phone says, I'm really sorry, I don't remember. And that's not because they're trying to be unhelpful, but it can be really amazing if you've got fabulous notes that details who you've spoken to, and when you've spoken to them, and a brief idea of what you've spoken to them about. It's also really useful when you come to the EHCP application process. And I know that when I did this with my own children, that actually lots of the information that I'd got, the school didn't. And so we were able to work together to put together the EHCP application. So my advice would be keep absolutely everything, and keep brilliant notes that you can share with people, because that'll be really helpful. The stay calm bit is something that I've perhaps struggled with on occasion, but it is, I think, the hardest bit sometimes. And as Peter said, it does sometimes feel like a bit of a battle. My advice would always be to stay polite and keep calm, but keep going. And I sometimes feel I'm a bit like a stuck record, but keep going. It has to be acknowledged that there is this sort of pushy parent narrative, and I've certainly come up against that, particularly where you come across as incredibly knowledgeable. There's some sort of defence mechanism in place there, and some pushback, and some, you know, some suggestion that you're maybe pushing a little bit too hard and you're coming across as a pushy parent. It's important to acknowledge that schools don't always get it right. I was a classroom teacher for 15 years, and with 30 kids in the room, you're never going to get it right all of the time. And as much as we'd like to, we're humans too. And I think it's striking that balance between making sure that you understand that there's mistakes on all sides. You're going to make mistakes. I've certainly had to go into school and apologise when I've been a bit stroppy, but equally that staff have had to apologise to me when they haven't got it right. That's okay, and I think that helps to build that partnership and that good relationship when all sides can acknowledge that we're not always going to get it right. You can ask for independent support, and particularly where you're really struggling. And I've found parent support to be absolutely fantastic. You can reach out to your local authority, and they should have a list of independent support available. The independent provider of specialist ed advice, which Peter mentioned earlier, are a fantastic source of information and support as well. If you just need somebody to talk to. And I would say, I teach on a Senko course and I've got 2 special needs children. I'd say I'm reasonably clued up, but there are still times when I think, do you know what, I just need to run this past somebody. I just want some, before I speak to school or before I speak to the local authority, actually, I just need a sounding board, and that's fine. I think sometimes helps to sort of calm things and smooth things over before you need to have difficult conversations. In terms of where you can get support, press the wrong button. I can only really speak for Wolverhampton because that's where we're based, but certainly IASS is Information Advice and Support Services. All local authorities should have one of those, but the one in Wolverhampton I can thoroughly recommend to you. Absolutely fantastic, and they've got a fab Facebook, Twitter page. The phone numbers really, they should all have a phone number that you can just ring and speak to somebody. And what you generally find is somebody will answer the phone and take a little bit of information about what it is that you want, and then they'll direct somebody to call you back that's the right person to help you out. So always a fab place to get some support. If you're based in Wolverhampton, we've got something called Voices for Parents, which was a group of mums that got together that felt that there was a real lack of support for parents. They're fantastic. They've got a Facebook page, and even if you're not in Wolverhampton, you could have a look at it. They've got loads of information and support there for parents. They also run lots of things during the holidays, so opportunities for autistic kids, but lots of opportunities for parents to network and get together too. So that's absolutely fantastic. Again, if you're in Wolverhampton, on Wolverhampton Ring Road, there is a youth centre called The Way. If you've ever driven around the Ring Road, it's the building that's got pretty coloured long lights on the front. It's absolutely massive, big sports hall, loads of facilities and support. They run a SEND session every Saturday from 10 till 12:30. It's 50p each to go in. Parents and kids all welcome. They do a fabulous full cooked breakfast as well. So we tend to sit in the cafe and eat and send the kids off to do the activities. And actually, do you know what? It's just a bit of a breather sometimes. It's a chance to talk to some other mums and dads, and the kids can be off playing badminton or painting or whatever. There's a lovely sensory room in there as well. So sometimes that level of support actually has been more helpful than anything else. I think Peter mentioned Special Needs Jungle. Loads of advice and support, and some lovely articles that you can read there as well. So there is help and support out there. Sometimes it's a little harder to find than I'd like, but there is help and support out there. Certainly if you're local to Wolverhampton, you're very welcome to reach out to me if you need any more information about support services. But that kind of concludes tonight's session. I am just going to flick back through my PowerPoint slides back to the very start where our mugshots were. There we go. I've popped our email addresses on there in case you wanted to reach out to any of us for any further advice and support. But Mel, are you there?
I am, yeah. Thanks so much, everybody. Perhaps I'll just leave it on the screen for a second, Zoe, in case anybody wants to jot those down. A massive thanks to the panelists today who have, been fantastic in providing this talk and a wealth of information. And hopefully, everybody's managed to find something useful from it and something you can take forward yourselves. Apologies for issue with Q&A chat. We're used to using Teams, so thank you for flagging those issues, and hopefully we got them sorted. But just to reassure you that no one's names or any questions will appear on any recording, so no one can see, outside of you what was shared. I've actually got 7 questions for you, and I'm conscious of time, so we will try to, as far as possible, stick to time. But if we run slightly over, then appreciate some people probably are still doing bedtime routines and so on. First question is there a way to support a child with autism to not mask?
Good question.
Julian, is that something you want to take?
I saw that question come up in the chat, and I've been thinking about it constantly for about the last half an hour. I suppose I would say that there's also a further question is, does that child want to stop masking, first of all? Because obviously it has to be their choice not to do so. And I would say, rather than actually come out or make a conscious decision to literally just stop masking one day, bear in mind that the people that you know in your life are used to you acting a certain way, and they expect you to behave that way, and they might be slightly unnerved if you suddenly appear to be quite slightly different. I would say my advice would be, if you have a very close friend, someone that you can literally share if that child has a very close friend that they can actually, share their thoughts and feelings with, that might be a really good opportunity to talk about, first of all, introduce the subject to masking and talk about how having to mask all the time is having an impact of them, so that they can literally gradually introduce to that friend the concept that they would like to stop masking, and get help and support from their friends to actually do so before literally, and then at that stage, once you've got friends on side who are actually helping support you, you can begin to sort of like be yourself more often with other people. And also as you go through life, you will meet, you have form more friendships and relationships with other people, friends, colleagues, and so on. Is that you can make the decision to sort of like not mask when you meet people for the first time. Because I think one of the reasons why autistic people go through life masking a lot is because we're really, really conscious of the fact that the friendships we have, we want to keep and maintain, and we don't want anything that we fear might actually disrupt or end those friendships. But when you meet people for the first time, and you're actually able to be yourself, you know from that point onwards that every friendship you make, people will be willing to accept you as you are.
I wonder whether it's something that gets, I could be wrong, whether it's something that maybe gets easier as you get older. So my youngest daughter is 7 and is a super masker, as the educational psychologist called her. And literally there are some days that she comes out of school and will have a meltdown on the playground. She can hold it together and mask all day, but comes home and the world falls apart. And we've tried quite a lot at home to encourage this sort of unmasking at school. I wonder whether she's just too young, and I wonder whether that's something maybe our participants might experience, depending on the age of their kids, I guess. That I wonder whether it's something that you become more conscious of maybe as you get older. Don't know.
Thanks.
Yeah, I
Thank
mean,
you. Thanks,
and also you simply just don't have the energy to do it, because you know, masking takes an awful lot of energy, and as you get older you have less energy, so you have to be more conscious about the need to preserve and maintain energy. So that was partly why I chose to stop masking, because I simply just couldn't do it anymore.
I suppose it depends on the individual and their circumstances, the age of the child, how comfortable they feel with their friends and so on. I think that probably leads in quite nicely to another question we've got. So somebody's asked, can parents input evidence for the assessment, and is that taken seriously, especially if the child is masking at school and in out of school groups? So will the parents' input be taken seriously, and also would they consider medical conditions that may be linked to autism, like encopresis, for example?
Yeah, just a couple of comments from me, and others might want to chip in. I think the absolutely kind of statutory position is, yes, of course their evidence will be taken seriously. You know, the kind of real world version of that is you need to present it in a way which is kind of I'm being very careful the word I choose, but you need to present it in its best form. Okay, so if you're able to triangulate, if you have more than one source, that's always a good thing. If you have written evidence, I think I get uneasy with things like videos and you know, audio recordings and things like that. I think we have to be very careful in respect of, you know, protecting children's privacy and rights and so forth. But there's no reason why parents' evidence shouldn't be taken seriously. And if it's not, you have rights to appeal, you have advocacy groups. And I think what I would suggest is, you know, you test your evidence out with appropriate other people. Use the kind of connections that Zoe's mentioned and that I've mentioned, and you know, don't go into any of these meetings underprepared. And I don't mean to make it sound confrontational, but I think in order for it to be taken seriously, you need to ensure that you've got it in order and you've got the right kind of material, I suppose. But I guess I'm speaking more about a statutory assessment process than an autism assessment, and I'll defer to others on that. So I don't know, Zoe or Julian.
I mean, I can speak to a child autism diagnosis, and I can say that the process through CAMS, I felt very listened to throughout the entire process. Yeah. I think it helped that actually that school backed what I was saying, and I think that's always helpful. But I absolutely felt that I was listened to, and that my thoughts and views were acknowledged. I think depending on the age of the child, so my middle child was 9 when we went through the autism diagnosis process. Although I was listened to, I would say what he had to say was far more listened to and far more impactful than anything that I offered. And so I think, again, depending on the age of your child, it may well be that actually the child being able to advocate for themselves where they can will become really important too.
Brilliant, thank you. Somebody's asked about private diagnoses, and this individual seeking private diagnoses, but is being told that this may not be accepted by the NHS or GP or other educational support services, and has asked if you have any experience of this or advice about private diagnoses.
So I paid for private ed psych for both my children. The ed psych report was prepared for autism panel, and so one of my children went through autism panel with a private ed psych speech and language report and an occupational therapy report, and we sailed through the autism panel, and the other one was knocked back. So 50-50, but I didn't feel at any point that I was disadvantaged by that, and in fact the private ed psych report was used for my son's education, health and care plan. Having said that, it's a huge financial drain on parents, and where at all possible I would strongly advise you to see whether that can be accessed through school, because it is costly, and it is a big drain on families to have to do that. I don't know what you think, Peter.
I think that, you know, there have been occasions in the past, and there probably are still now, areas of the country where there is a kind of a bias towards the in-house officers and you know, the statutorily appointed reporting officers or whatever. But I think there's an analogy with private health, in the sense that, you know, there's much more interrelationship, isn't there, between, you know, people can dip in and out of private and national health, and I think it's common practice now for people to have private assessments and to use those as part of the system. I don't think it gives you any great shortcut, but I don't think it's necessarily a barrier. You know, there will always be occasions where people feel it to be so, but there's no reason why it shouldn't. It should be, I don't think.
And interestingly, following on from that, somebody else has asked about EHCP. So in this instance, the child is refusing school. The parent wants to apply for an EHCP, but the school won't, as she does well at school at the moment. So she masks, but has reached burnout as a result, and is asking, is it better to wait for the CAMHS appointment and private autism assessment before applying for an EHCP?
It's really difficult to give a judgment about that. I mean, I think the only thing I would want to say is there is nothing stopping you requesting an EHCP as a parent. So, but obviously, if the school is not supportive of it, then it's going to be a harder ask, isn't it? So I don't know what your perspective is.
Yeah, and so from personal experience, so my youngest child, where school don't see the same things that I see at home, they aren't as supportive, and it has made life much more difficult in terms of getting through an autism diagnosis, and certainly we won't reach the EHCP threshold, I don't think. In terms of when to apply is really difficult, because ideally you'd want to have as much evidence as possible right from the get-go, but in that situation where maybe things are quite desperate, it might be appropriate to ask for the needs assessment, and in your request for a needs assessment, say that this information from CAMHS and a private autism diagnosis is on the way. It's whether that information will be there before they then make a decision on whether an EHCP should be issued. So it's a difficult one to call. I mean, how long will you wait for CAMHS? How long is the private diagnosis going to take? I think it's something that you just have to make that call as a parent, judging the deadlines as to whether you think the information will be there before the 20 weeks is up.
And somebody else has asked about, is autism something that can develop into a more obvious state with time? So in other words, as the person gets older, can their signs appear more strongly, or is it simply that the parent didn't recognise the signs in the first place?
Shall I go first?
Yes.
I think the important thing to note about autism, and this links to a lot of the questions that have been asked so far, there is a fundamental problem with the diagnostic process itself, because in order to get the help and support that autistic people need, we often have to play up to the fact that we're disabled even though many of us don't consider ourselves to be disabled. And with the diagnostic process itself, it's not enough to actually have, or show that you have autistic traits. You also have to evidence how they are causing you problems as a result. Now, that means it's perfectly possible for an autistic person to be in a comfortable, secure environment where they're not experiencing any problems, and therefore they won't display any obvious signs that they have autism. But the thing with autism is that your ability to cope with the world can be influenced by so many outside internal environmental factors, and change, significant change, can be a massive factor in that. So what tends to happen during the life of an autistic person, that you reach significant sort of like milestones in your life journey that are really challenging and can really cause anxiety. And that's when they can actually flag up or make your autistic traits much, much more visible. Now, there are obvious ones, for instance, such as starting school, but it might not be primary school where it becomes noticeable. It might be when you go to secondary school. It could be things like the group of children that you were friends with at primary school aren't going to the same secondary school that you're going. And that can be a moment where you suddenly have, what would be like a sort of an autistic spiral where you literally autistic traits become much more visible. It could be university, could be starting work for the same time. But alongside this is the issue of masking, because what a lot of autistic people do is they use masking as a way to fit in and not be noticeable. But your ability to do that decreases with age, because, as I said, it takes more and more energy to maintain this illusion. And one of the interesting things is that a lot of people who experience a mental health breakdown, particularly in their late 40s or early 50s, are increasingly now getting an autism diagnosis, because, actually going through life, literally having struggles and not actually getting the help and support you need will inevitably lead to some form of tipping point where you simply can't cope anymore. And I'm a passionate advocate for people getting help and support that they need as early as possible to avoid ever having to go through that situation.
Thanks, Julian. Just a couple more, I think we've got 3 more in total. So somebody's asked about a question about the relationship between ADHD and autism in terms of diagnoses. So they're at the start of an ADHD process, but still on the waiting list for an autism diagnosis. They've been assured that the information will be shared across the services. And they're asking, is there anything happening nationally to bring these closer together?
I don't know.
Not that I'm aware of.
No.
I would imagine nationally, no. It will depend on your local services, because they'll all operate in slightly different ways. So I know, for example, I live right on the border of Wolverhampton and Staffordshire. I've got one kid in a Wolverhampton school and one kid in a Staffordshire school. And actually the process is, despite the fact that the 2 counties border one another, is completely different for autism diagnosis. So I would imagine there isn't anything nationally at the moment pulling all of those things together. I know there's certainly talk about pulling the EHCP process together so that we're all using nationally standardised paperwork and those sorts of things, and that could come in with the changes in 2025. But as far as diagnosis is concerned, quite often that's through the National Health Service at a local level. So there's nothing that I'm aware of. I don't know whether any Peter or Julian.
No, I think it's something I'd have to go and look into. I haven't got a good answer at this stage. So about Julian.
But I suppose then, is it, I would ask, what seems obvious to ask for me is there a good marrying up of these different services though, so that if you're waiting on 2 diagnoses simultaneously, that they do speak to each other to try and support that?
Again, I think that will come down to local health authorities. I can speak to my experience in Wolverhampton, where the answer to that is yes, they are sharing information, and actually the pathways for autism and ADHD diagnosis tend to run side by side. So yes, there's lots of information sharing. Whether that's the same across other local health authorities, I couldn't speak to that.
I'll move on to the next question, but Zoe, just to let you know that somebody's asked if you would be able to share some links for Staffordshire services in the chat, if you have any. In terms of keeping private records, what kind of things would you need to keep? I know you mentioned some things already, Zoe. Is there anything in particular that individuals should look to kind of keep that's useful for them in keeping a record?
Share the first part of that. Sorry, I went off trying to copy and paste.
Sorry,
Staffordshire.
I basically gave you a task to do, and then I asked you a question just to make that little bit more challenging for you. In terms of keeping private records, the individual's asking what kind of things do you need to keep?
Everything and anything, and things that sometimes you don't think are going to be useful that end up being useful. I literally keep everything. I put read receipts on the emails, and I print those and keep them. All clinic letters that come from hospitals. I keep like a diary of sort of when we've been to hospitals or when we've had contact with people. I keep little notes about who I've spoken to in school, and that might seem a little bit over the top, but actually sometimes those things have been really useful when I've had to go back to them, particularly where, so as I went through the EHCP process from my middle one, we went through 3 case officers, and so I would then go, well, I spoke to somebody, and they would go, well, who did you speak to? When did you speak to them? And it's not that they don't keep amazing records, because I'm sure they do, but it's like getting to them quickly. Whereas if you can go, well, I spoke to this person on this date, and this was the gist of the conversation, actually it helps to move things along really quickly, to save somebody having to go away and look it up and try and find out who you spoke to. So I always take names. I always keep a little handwritten note of who I've spoken to and when, whether that's school, somebody at the hospital, anything and everything. The more detailed notes that you can keep, the better, because you might need to refer back to them at some point.
Brilliant. And sort of linked to the previous question actually that was asked, somebody's asked, is it possible for a child to be assessed if you're not sure if they have autism or ADHD or dyspraxia? So do you need to go down different avenues for diagnosis if you're not sure which one might apply?
I would think you're nearly always going to be in that position where you're not sure. You know, the assessment. I mean, I may be wrong in that, but I think certainly speaking of, you know, my own experience, my younger son, we really are not clear what his issues are, but we're clear he's got issues. Do you know what I mean? And I think, you know, the starting points are fairly similar for a range of diagnoses. I don't know what others think.
I would say similarly. So I would say my son's stereotypically autistic, I suppose, and displays many of the things that Julian talked about. And right from the off, we were guided towards an autism pathway. However, with my younger child, she's female, so as Julian quite rightly pointed out, autism doesn't present the same. We really weren't sure. You know, do we go down an autism diagnosis pathway, or is there something else? I would say we've been really skillfully guided by school, who've been helpful, but also by an educational psychologist who was really helpful in supporting us into which direction to go. But initially there wasn't a sort of a focus when she was assessed of, we are going to see if she's autistic, or we are going to see if she's got ADHD. It was a sort of a very general thing to start with, and then I think once more information is collated, you may be guided to which pathway would be most appropriate.
And who prompts that? So if the school hasn't identified the need for that, can the parent prompt that, for example?
I think so. I think it's a collaborative conversation in my experience, where, you know, I've been able to bring some stuff to the table. We were really lucky that we've got an amazing educational psychologist who took what we'd said and what school said and gave us fantastic advice on where to go next. And I would say probably your educational psychologist is probably the best person to have those conversations with to guide you in the right direction.
Brilliant, thank you. And final question then.
I would just say, just on this, is that it's really, I didn't get a chance to say this, but it's really important to note that it could actually be all three. And in some cases, it often is, because, you know, if you have autism, you can also have ADHD and you can also have dyspraxia.
Yeah. Sorry, final question. So how do you know if behaviours are not neurotypical when it all seems logical to you?
That's for Julian.
I saved that one to last because I thought what a great question. And also, how do you know?
Indeed, how do you know? I mean, I really, again, that's kind of like an impossible question to ask, but generally speaking, autistic people, well, I can talk from my own experience here. We tend to be very guided by logic, and not just in an obvious way, because we tend to be able to see things that that other people really can't see, and they sort of like present ourselves to us as really obvious solutions to problems, and really fit very closely with our understanding of what logic actually is. And I find myself constantly surprised by friends and people I know in their simple inability to sort of like see and understand the way that things that I can. But they would probably look at me and say that I'm probably less fun than I should be.
No. Sorry, there has been one final question that's come in that I missed. Apologies. What was the role of a speech and language therapist with diagnosing children, and have you found them useful?
Oh, well, I mean, not so much with my experience is not so much with autism, but certainly with learning disabilities, speech and language therapy has been central to every aspect of my older son's experience, really. And he's nonverbal, and speech, you kind of assume speech and language therapy is about speech production, but it's about so much more. You know, it informs a whole range of learning experience. Again, anyone else want to add anything?
My experience of speech and language was during the autism diagnosis process, where they assessed my middle child just to see whether the social communication difficulties that he was experiencing were as a result of a speech and language need, or whether they felt that it fell under the umbrella of autism. And other than that, I've had no real support from speech and language. And I would say that's probably fairly typical for from my experience of talking to other parents going through the autism diagnosis process, that it's used as a sort of just to check that there isn't another speech and language need there, or whether they feel that the social and communication difficulties are as a result of autism.
Brilliant, thank you. Every time I say there's one last question, there's one last question. This is going to be the last question, so apologies if anybody else has got anything else. I'm going to have to signpost you towards the email addresses, but somebody has asked about a family member who basically is saying of ADHD, autism, micro deletion, and apologies if I'm saying that incorrectly. They're trying to get these assessed before spring next year, but have had to get pals involved because she'll leave first school at that time. They've requested occupational health referral and dietitian. She has an EHCP for mainstream school, but they feel she needs specialist provision. They're in South Staffs. They have an educational psychologist report because she has delayed speech and language delay associated with intellectual disability. Do you think speech and language services assessments should be requested as well?
It's really difficult to advise on specific cases. What I would say is that as a parent, you kind of know what's best and what's needed, and if you feel that there is a need for speech and language, that you should absolutely be able to request that and have a conversation with the GP or hospital consultant if you've got people involved. I would be really, I mean, you would hope that if you as a parent had made the call, that would actually be really useful and a great support for your child, that you'd be listened to. I know that if you've got pals involved, that might not be the case, but it's difficult to make a call on whether speech and language is needed when we don't know the child or the circumstances. What I would say is if you feel really strongly that that's something that would be really helpful, is to reach out and to ask.
Thank you. I have to say a huge thanks to the panel who, I mean, we've gone way over the time, but I think that reflects really the need for knowledge and information, and you guys are really the experts. So just huge thanks for you guys giving up your evening to talk about this topic and to share your wealth of experience, knowledge and research with everybody. We are intending to make this into a series and to do follow-up sessions. So I've put my email in the chat. You'll know I'm not the expert here, but I'll coordinate these types of events. So if anybody feels that there's anything that could be included in a follow-up session that would be useful, please share it with us. Likewise, if you've any feedback, I'm seeing people put in the chat, thank you, that's been so helpful, so informative, and that's great to hear, but we can only be guided and we can only deliver, in accordance with the information we receive. So it's really useful to get feedback. Julian is also our podcast supremo, and he does podcasts for the university. If anybody wants to talk or talk more about kind of their experiences of autism themselves or with their children, he does a series of podcasts. He'd love to hear from you as well. Sorry, Julian.
Can I also say that actually I've just noticed my email address is slightly wrong. It's two
Oh,
N's, so
sorry.
it's j.gwinneett, in case anybody's
I
trying to
apologise,
contact
Julian.
me and they can't. But as Mel just said, I'd be really happy to talk to anybody about either their direct experience or their experience of being a parent, or even I'm very keen to hear about the views of people who work in education with people who have autism.
Yeah,
because I think that's something that needs to be talked about more.
Apologies if I've missed off any questions in the chat and the Q&A. I'm trying to listen, but also monitor that. So if I've missed something, please do direct that question to the relevant person. We are hoping in the next session to possibly include autistic children in the session, either pre-recorded or live, because we think if we're going to be talking about autism in children, who's better to be experts on that subject than them themselves. For now, once again, thanks very much to the panel. Please do follow up if you want to with any of us. Wish you all a lovely rest of your evening, and we'll send further details out about the recording in the next week. Thanks very much, everybody. Bye-bye.
Bye.